Tensions between France and Russia over their influence in Africa have again risen to the surface. Both countries have a vested interest in Africa, and shifts in the geopolitical landscape have seen many French-speaking countries looking to Russia as an ally. Recent reports suggest that Russian President Vladimir Putin believes that French President Emmanuel Macron's criticism of Moscow on Ukraine is due to resentment to losing allies in Africa. To discuss this, I'm now joined by Dr. Chidochashe Nyere, a researcher at the Institute of Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Nyere, good to speak to you. Thanks so much for your time. Let's start off with a look at the specific actions or policies that France has undertaken in Africa that Russia perceives as indicative of resentment towards Russian involvement in the region.
Good afternoon, Hugo, and good afternoon to the viewers. So, to be frank with you, there aren't any specific actions or policies that France has undertaken for Russia to interpret that as resentment towards itself. However, we should always be cognizant of the fact that there is an ongoing war, the Russia-Ukraine war. So this is the context within which Russia then interprets what has happened, because remember, France has announced that it will be sending troops to Ukraine to support Ukraine. And therefore, it is propaganda from the Russian side to then say France has taken policies or actions that want to undermine its influence in Africa. Remember, these two are at war because France has involved itself, particularly with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So this is where it's coming from. Also, let us remember that these two have faced off in Africa. So if you remember in the Malian war, Mali was supported by the Wagner group, right? The Wagner group is Russian. So until the Wagner leader died, Russia had always distanced itself from the Wagner group. But it is now obvious, because now even the head of state of Russia, President Vladimir Putin, speaks of the Wagner group. So it is clear that it is a Russian outfit. Now let us remember in that Malian conflict, they have faced off. France was on the side of the pro-French Malian authorities that actually sought its help in terms of the military engagements there in Mali to ward off so-called rebels. So this is where they have already had some engagement and some exchange of fire. So coming from that end, we can then say those will be the specific actions that could link Russia to what it then interprets as France undermining its authority in Africa. Otherwise, there are no known policies that France has undertaken to warrant what Russia has interpreted in this context.
So, Dr. Nyere, let's talk about the history and how France's historical relationship with its former colonies in Africa influences interactions with Russia and its activities on the continent. Obviously, this must be something that the French would be a little bit sore over.
That is correct. So, France and its former colonies, they have a very thorny relationship, and Russia is quite aware of that. But I want to firstly put it on record that both Russia and France are imperial states. So with France, it's clear it has colonized more African countries. With Russia, it is also an imperial state, although its record in Africa, we cannot link Russia to colonialism in Africa. However, we know that Russia has overtaken other states. We can think of the Crimea, and right now in the very war that we are speaking about, the Russia-Ukraine war. So the historical relations that African countries have with France are thorny, because until last year, France still had an unwarranted hold on African countries. So it is because it has been chased out, particularly from Mali, from Burkina Faso and Niger, right? Now that has happened, the influence and hold is winning off. And of course, Russia would want to play into that. So Russia has actually done that to sanitize itself, to say we have never colonized any African country. In fact, in terms of its own engagement in Africa, it has always been at the behest of African heads of state. So Russia is justified in this particular instance because it has the backing of the African states. In fact, it has involved itself only insofar as it has been allowed to involve itself by the African head of states of the affected countries. We cannot say the same thing with France. France, we know, although it thrived particularly with colonialism, but it has continued to exercise unhinged influence through the policies that it continued to run and use its former colonies for its gains. For instance, there is what they call colonial tax that has been paid by African countries even up to date. There are some countries that are still paying the so-called colonial tax to France. And of course, that is a thorny issue, which also then explains why the so-called coups in the Sahel region have received popular support. Because the masses, the people are saying enough is enough. We cannot continue to be under France's yoke. And so the establishments that have been perceived as pro-French have then been disposed by military governments, and that's why there was such popular support of the so-called coups.
Now, Dr. Nyere, you've spoken about countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso that have explicitly pushed out the French. Now, this invariably offers an opportunity to many other nations, or potentially a handful of nations, to fill in those shoes, so to speak. And one of those nations is Russia. Is this also a source of this potential conflict, or this conflict that we're witnessing?
So I just want to say something before I respond to your question. The issue is that Africa has always been embroiled in all these conflicts and the so-called world wars, yet these are not our wars. And there is something problematic with us thinking that because France has taken leave of Africa, there should be a gap that it has left that should be taken over by some other country. I think that is already problematic, and part of it is because our governments think in that line. And that is problematic because then we are saying, as Africans, we cannot be on our own. We cannot be and we cannot exist on our own without outside influence, right? That being said, it is quite true to interpret that France has positioned, Russia rather, has positioned itself favorable in this case, in the sense that it knows that France has been pushed out of African countries, the so-called Francophone region. It has been pushed out. And of course, because international relations are such that you rely on other partners. So in this case, Russia is positioning itself to take up that space in terms of equal engagement with African countries. So we could interpret it in that way, to say Russia has taken that lead to position itself because it has already cooperated with these African countries in many fronts, and as equal partners, not as colonial subjects as France was to African countries.
Well, I suppose the issue is not economic more than it is based purely on security issues. I mean, one of the reasons that the French have been in these various countries is to offer some form of security support. So whether it's the United Nations Security Council or various forms of the AU Security Council that have been trying to ensure some form of stability in those countries. And the question is, when the French move out, there is then a growing need to ensure that there is some security or some stability. I mean, you have talked about the Sahel region, and we have witnessed over the last few years that many of these nations in that area have been unstable.
So I beg to differ to say the issue is about security more than it is economic. In fact, I argue that it is more economic than it is a security matter. Let's look at it this way. when France continued to extend its influence on African countries after colonialism, the interest was not that France was to provide security to African countries. Even when France was invited by the Malian government, for instance, in 2012, to come in and assist its security apparatus in terms of military training and engagement, the primary issue for France was not that it sought to provide security, right? Its primary function there was to safeguard its economic interests, right? So that is very clear. The reason why these former colonial masters want to keep a hold on African countries, it is because they benefit economically. Now, they also benefit when these conflicts that are sometimes misconstrued as African conflicts. When these conflicts are happening, what is also happening in the background is that they are siphoning mineral resources that belong to African countries. So this is actually more economic than it is about security. However, to answer your question, yes, France was invited by the Malian authorities to assist in the military training of their troops, and in some regard, they failed. In fact, that mission failed because 10 years later, they were still suffering from the insurgents that the operation sought to cure. So we cannot say that the security apparatus, which was purported to be the reason why France was in Mali, achieved its purpose. It failed dismally. So again, the insurgency was very tactful in that it didn't operate only in Mali, right? It was cross-border. So this is how they outsmarted the French authorities and the Malian authorities together. Because it was trans-border, they would go into different countries at different times. So it was difficult to arrest the insurgents in the first place. And it continues to date. Therefore, the issue wasn't really about security. It was more about economics for France. And of course, the Malian government may have benefited in terms of providing some pseudo-security to maybe boost their egos. But that operation failed, and we still sit with the insurgency today in Mali, for example.
Dr. Nyere, you're a thought leader on the Pan-African landscape, and one of the issues that we're discussing now is there always seems to be once, in fact, there is a suggestion that when one superpower or one former colonial master leaves a particular country, it opens it up to other former colonial masters, other superpowers to fill in those gaps. And I suppose one of the reasons that happens is because Africa on its own is not sufficiently united, or is not trading on its own, or is not supporting other African nations. What needs to be done to close this gap, or this notion that when a former colonial power vacates or leaves a particular country, that there is then need for another ally of a superpower size to come in?
So I understand where the question is coming from, but international relations generally are such that each country needs other countries, right? So it's not necessarily about former colonial masters leaving Africa and therefore creating a gap for other former colonial masters to come into the fray. I think characterizing it that way is missing the point. The point is international relations need to happen organically. They need to happen in such a way that they are beneficial to both parties. So what needs to happen, and I say this at the risk of sounding like a broken record, with African nations, we need to unite. I mean, I cannot overemphasize that very point, because part of the reason why these so-called former colonial masters come into Africa and still there is no change in the lives of peoples of Africa is because we are fragmented. As Africans, we are fragmented, and it's very easy for any global player to manipulate that system, to manipulate us, such that at the end of the day, we are pit one against the other. And this continues to happen. In fact, this was the main objective of the divide and conquer, right? So the Berlin West Africa Conference instituted that. It inaugurated that. And that script continues unabated today. So until we unite, unionize, and amalgamate as African countries, we will not be able to defeat the machinations of the global world that are designed against us. So unity and unification of purpose are primary things we need to do. And we also then need other partners. So for instance, as Africans, if we were united, we would be able to then negotiate with other players such as China. Now, China and Russia are good examples of global players that have not colonized Africa, but they are willing to partner with Africa. The problem still lies with us African countries because of our fragmentation and because of our divisions that are really colonial. It is then difficult for us to bargain and stand as a unit when we engage with other countries such as China. China is unitary.
Dr. Nyere, I'm afraid we've run short of time, but I have to thank you for making time and chatting to us today. Research Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversations, Dr. Chidochashe Nyere, and he was walking us through that apparent